June 6, 1944, 11:45 in the morning. Hochwald, East Prussia. The sound is the rhythmic clacking of a typewriter echoing through the corridors of a heavily fortified bunker complex hidden deep in the forests of East Prussia. This is the Führerhauptquartier Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, one of Hitler's wartime headquarters. But on this particular morning, the Führer is not here. He is at his mountain retreat in Bavaria, and word of the Allied invasion has only just reached him. The man who is at Wolfschanze, however, is in many ways even more dangerous than Hitler. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, head of the Gestapo, architect of the Holocaust, commander of the Waffen-SS, and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, sits at a massive oak desk reviewing reports. He is 43 years old, but looks older. His face is pale, almost bloodless. His eyes, magnified by round steel-rimmed spectacles, give him an owlish appearance that masks the calculating cruelty behind them. Himmler does not look like a mass murderer. He looks like a bureaucrat, which is precisely what makes him so terrifying. He is a bureaucrat of death, a man who can order the extermination of millions with the same detached efficiency that others use to order office supplies. On this morning, Himmler is reviewing reports from the Western Front. The invasion has been underway for approximately 4 hours. Initial reports are fragmentary, confused, contradictory, but certain facts are becoming clear. The Allies have landed at multiple points along the Normandy coast, the Atlantic Wall has been breached, and German forces, despite years of preparation, are being pushed back. Himmler's SS adjutant, Sturmbannführer Werner Grothmann, enters the office carrying a leather dispatch case. He salutes with precision. Reichsführer, urgent intelligence from France. The latest situation reports from the invasion beaches. Himmler sets down the document he was reading and extends his hand. Grothmann hands him a sheaf of decoded radio messages and typed summaries. Himmler reads methodically, his face expressionless. He reads reports from Omaha Beach, where American forces are suffering catastrophic casualties, but slowly gaining ground. He reads reports from Utah Beach, where Americans have landed with lighter opposition. He reads reports from Gold Beach and Sword Beach, where British forces are ashore and pushing inland. And then he reaches the report from Juno Beach. Himmler stops reading. His eyes, behind those circular lenses, narrow slightly. He reads the section again, more carefully this time. Then he looks up at Grothmann. "Is this intelligence confirmed?" he asks quietly. His voice is high-pitched, almost reedy, completely at odds with his position of power. Grothmann nods. "Yes, Reichsführer. Multiple sources, radio intercepts from the 716 Infantry Division, Luftwaffe reconnaissance reports, naval observations, the Canadian 3rd Infantry. Division achieved breakthrough of coastal defenses at Juno Beach in approximately 40 to 50 minutes from initial landing." Himmler's expression does not change, but those who know him well would recognize the slight tightening around his mouth, the minute adjustment of his posture. These are signs that Reichsführer Himmler is displeased, and when Himmler is displeased, people die. "Canadians," Himmler says slowly, "the breakthrough was achieved by Canadians. It is not a question. It is a statement of fact that Himmler is processing, categorizing, filing away in his meticulous mind alongside thousands of other facts about enemies of the Reich." Grothmann, sensing his superior's mood, adds carefully, "The SS units in reserve, particularly the 12th SS Panzer Division, are prepared to counterattack. They should be in position to engage the Canadians within hours." Himmler nods slowly. "The 12th SS, the Hitler Jugend Division. Yes, that is appropriate." He pauses, and when he nods, speaks again. His voice carries a cold satisfaction. "Let the Canadians face our youngest soldiers. Let them face the future of the Reich. We shall see how these colonials perform against true National Socialist warriors." This statement, recorded by Grothmann in his post-war testimony and corroborated by other sources, reveals the lens through which Himmler viewed the Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach, not as a tactical problem to be solved, though it was that, but as an ideological confrontation, a test of racial theories, a validation or contradiction of the Nazi worldview that Himmler had spent decades constructing and enforcing. Because Himmler was not just a military commander, he was the chief ideologue of racial theory in Nazi Germany. He believed, with an intensity that bordered on religious fervor, in the superiority of the Aryan race. He believed that Germans represented the pinnacle of human evolution, and he believed that race, not training or equipment or leadership, determined military effectiveness. The Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach challenged these beliefs, And what Himmler said in response over the hours and days that followed reveals not just his reaction to a tactical defeat, but the fundamental contradictions and delusions at the heart of Nazi ideology. This is not just the story of a battle. This is the story of what happens when ideology collides with reality and ideology refuses to yield. This is the story of a man who built his entire worldview on racial superiority, being confronted with evidence that his worldview was wrong. And it is the story of how that collision shaped German military decisions in ways that cost German lives and contributed to Allied victory. What Himmler said when Canada broke through Juno Beach in 47 minutes would influence how the SS fought for the rest of the Normandy campaign. It would shape how German intelligence assessed Allied capabilities, and it would demonstrate that even in the face of overwhelming evidence, ideological certainty can blind people to truth. Because Himmler's response to the Canadian breakthrough was not to adjust his theories to match observed reality. It was to adjust his interpretation of reality to preserve his theories, and that, more than any single tactical defeat, explains why Nazi Germany lost the war. To understand Himmler's reaction to the Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach, you must first understand Himmler's worldview. Heinrich Himmler was not born a Nazi. He became one. In his youth, he was a failed chicken farmer, a man with grandiose ambitions and limited prospects. He joined the Nazi Party in its early days and rose through a combination of obsequiousness to Hitler, bureaucratic skill, and absolute ruthlessness. By 1944, Himmler controlled vast apparatus of power. The SS, originally Hitler's personal bodyguard, had grown into a state within a state. It included the Waffen-SS combat divisions that fought alongside the regular Wehrmacht. It included the Gestapo, the secret police. It included the concentration camp system, and it included Himmler's personal obsession, racial research and racial policy. Himmler believed that he was not just enforcing Nazi racial laws, but discovering fundamental truths about human nature. He sponsored pseudoscientific research into racial characteristics. He established breeding programs to create racially pure Germans. He oversaw the extermination of millions of people deemed racially inferior. And he convinced himself that all of this was not criminal but scientific, that he was not a mass murderer but a pioneer of racial science. In Himmler's racial hierarchy, Germans, specifically Nordic Germans, occupied the highest position. Then came other Germanic peoples, Dutch, Scandinavians, some British. Below them were Slavs, considered useful as slaves but not worthy of freedom. And at the bottom were Jews, Roma, and other groups marked for extermination. But where did Canadians fit in this hierarchy? Himmler had given this question some thought, though not as much as he had given to peoples closer to Germany. Canadians were, in his view, a mixed population. Some were of British origin, making them partially Germanic and therefore partially acceptable. Others were French, which Himmler viewed with suspicion because he considered the French to be racially mongrelized. And the fact that these different groups coexisted in Canada, that they had not separated into racially pure enclaves, suggested to Himmler that Canadian society was degenerate. A healthy racial society, in Himmler's ideology, would naturally segregate into racial groups. The fact that Canada did not do this meant that Canadians lacked proper racial consciousness, and lacking that consciousness, they should be weak. They should lack the martial spirit that comes from racial purity and racial pride. This was Himmler's theory. And theories for Himmler were not hypotheses to be tested. They were truths to be confirmed. So when he received the intelligence report that Canadians had broken through at Juno Beach in approximately 47 minutes, his first instinct was not to question his theories about Canadian weakness. It was to find explanations for the breakthrough that preserved those theories. Himmler stands and walks to the large map of Western Europe that dominates one wall of his office. He locates Juno Beach on the map and studies the surrounding area. Grothmann, his adjutant, remains standing at attention, waiting for orders or questions. Finally, Himmler speaks. The report states that the Canadians achieved breakthrough in 47 minutes. What was the strength of the defending force? Grothmann consults his notes. The 716 Infantry Division, Reichsführer, approximately regimental strength in the immediate Juno Beach sector, perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 men. Himmler nods slowly. The 716, what is the composition of this division? Are they first-line troops? Grothmann hesitates. This is dangerous ground. The truth is that the 716 Infantry Division was a static coastal defense unit composed largely of older men, recovered wounded, and Osttruppen, Soviet prisoners of war who had volunteered to fight for Germany rather than starve in POW camps. They were not elite troops, they were garrison soldiers, but telling Himmler that the breakthrough was due to German weakness rather than Canadian strength is risky. The 716 is a coastal defense division, Reichsfuhrer, static deployment, not equipped for mobile operations. It is a careful answer, factual but not explicitly critical. Himmler absorbs this information and immediately sees a way to incorporate it into his worldview. So the breakthrough was not achieved against our best forces, Himmler says, and there is satisfaction in his voice. The Canadians broke through against garrison troops. This tells us nothing about Canadian capability against proper German soldiers, against SS divisions. This is Himmler's first strategy for dealing with the cognitive dissonance of the Canadian breakthrough, minimize its significance by emphasizing the quality of the defenders. The Canadians succeeded, yes, but only against weak opposition. This allows Himmler to preserve his belief in Canadian racial inferiority. But Grothman, who has access to more detailed intelligence, feels obligated to provide additional context. Reichsfuhrer, the intelligence assessments note that the Canadian forces at Juno Beach utilized specialized armor and tactics, amphibious tanks, mine-clearing vehicles, concentrated artillery support. The breakthrough was not simply a matter of overwhelming weak defenses. It appears to have been a well-executed combined arms assault. Himmler turns from the map to look at his adjutant. His expression is unreadable behind those spectacles. You are suggesting that the Canadians demonstrated military competence? Grothman, realizing he may have overstepped, backpedals slightly. I am reporting what the intelligence assessments state, Reichsfuhrer. The assessments note that Allied forces, including the Canadians, have been training extensively for amphibious operations. They have developed specialized equipment and tactics for beach assaults. Himmler considers this. He cannot dismiss intelligence entirely, that would be foolish. But he can interpret it in ways that preserve his worldview. The equipment and tactics you describe were developed by the Americans and British, Himmler says firmly. The Canadians are merely implementing plans created by others. They are tools, not craftsmen. This is consistent with what we know about colonial populations. They can follow orders, they can use equipment provided to them, but they lack the creative intelligence and warrior spirit to develop such systems themselves. This interpretation allows Himmler to acknowledge Canadian success, while denying Canadian capability. The Canadians succeeded, but only because they were given good equipment and good plans by their Anglo-American masters. Left to their own devices, they would have failed. It is a convenient fiction, but it is a fiction. Grothman, a professional soldier beneath his SS uniform, knows this, but he also knows that contradicting the Reichsfuhrer on ideological matters is dangerous, so he simply nods and waits for further orders. Himmler returns to his desk and picks up the intelligence report again. He reads through it one more time, looking for specific details. When he finishes, he makes a statement that Grothman will remember and document in his post-war testimony. The Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach is regrettable, but not strategically significant. The Canadians have established a beachhead. This was expected. What matters now is how they perform when they face true opposition. When they meet the SS, we will see what these colonials are made of. I predict they will break quickly. Mongrel populations always lack staying power. This prediction, made with absolute confidence, reveals how deeply Himmler's racial ideology has blinded him to military reality. He is not analyzing the situation based on tactical factors, force ratios, logistics, or terrain. He is analyzing it based on his theories about racial character, and he is so certain of his theories that he makes predictions that will be proven catastrophically wrong within days. Over the next several hours, as more detailed reports arrive from Normandy, Himmler's staff provides him with additional information about the Canadian assault at Juno Beach. They report on Canadian casualties, which were significant, approximately 340 killed and around 700 wounded on D-Day itself. Himmler seizes on this information. You see, he says to his staff, the Canadians took heavy casualties. This proves they lack tactical sophistication. A proper Germanic assault would have been more efficient, with lower losses relative to gains achieved. This is classic Himmler. He takes a data point and interprets it to confirm his pre-existing beliefs. The fact that the Canadians took casualties while achieving breakthrough could be interpreted multiple ways. It could mean they were willing to accept losses to maintain momentum. It could mean the defenses were stronger than expected. It could mean many things. But Himmler interprets it as evidence of Canadian incompetence because that interpretation fits his ideology. On June 7th, D+1, Himmler receives the first reports of contact between Canadian forces and the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Jugend. This SS division, composed largely of teenagers from the Hitler Youth Organization, is one of Himmler's personal projects. These boys, indoctrinated from childhood in Nazi ideology, represent to Himmler the future of the Reich. They are racially pure. They are ideologically committed. They are young, strong, and fanatical. And they are about to face the Canadians who broke through at Juno Beach. Himmler anticipates a crushing German victory. He has convinced himself that when proper German soldiers, especially SS soldiers, meet the Canadians in battle, the racial superiority of the Germans will manifest in military superiority. The initial reports from the 12th SS seem to confirm this. The Hitler Jugend Division launches counterattacks against Canadian positions near Carpiquet and Authie. The fighting is intense and brutal. The SS troops fight with fanatical determination, and the Canadians, who have been advancing rapidly, are forced to slow down and consolidate. Himmler reads these reports with satisfaction. The Canadians have met real opposition, and they have stopped, he tells his staff. This is as predicted. Colonial troops can succeed against weak opposition, but lack the fortitude to face elite forces. But as more detailed reports arrive over the following days, a different picture emerges. The Canadians have not been defeated. They have not retreated. They have dug in and are holding their positions against repeated SS attacks. Moreover, they are inflicting heavy casualties on the Hitler Jugend Division. The fighting around Caen, where Canadians and the 12th SS clash repeatedly, becomes some of the most vicious of the entire Normandy campaign. Neither side gives ground willingly. Both take horrific casualties. And slowly, painfully, a truth emerges that Himmler does not want to acknowledge. The Canadians are matching the SS blow for blow. Himmler receives a detailed report on June 10th, 4 days after the invasion, from the commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Standartenführer Kurt Meyer. The report is frank about the difficulties the division is facing. Meyer writes that Canadian forces are well-trained, aggressively led, and extremely tenacious in defense. He notes that Canadian artillery is highly effective, and that Canadian infantry, when supported by tanks, is very difficult to dislodge from prepared positions. The report does not say the Canadians are superior to the SS, but it does say they are formidable opponents. Himmler reads this report in his office at Hochwald. He is alone. No witnesses to his reaction. But we know from his subsequent actions and statements what he must have thought. Because the report from Meyer contradicts everything Himmler believes about racial hierarchy and military capability. If the Canadians are performing this well against the SS, if they are not breaking as Himmler predicted, then either his racial theories are wrong or there must be some other explanation. Himmler, incapable of admitting that his theories might be wrong, searches for alternative explanations. Over the next several days, Himmler makes a series of statements to his staff and subordinates that reveal his evolving attempt to reconcile reality with ideology. On June 11th, he tells a gathering of SS officers at Hochwald, "The Canadian forces in Normandy are not typical Canadians. Intelligence suggests they are stiffened by British officers and NCOs. The competence we are seeing is British competence being directed through Canadian troops." This explanation has no basis in fact. The Canadian divisions in Normandy were entirely Canadian in composition, led by Canadian officers using Canadian doctrine. But the explanation allows Himmler to preserve his belief in Canadian inferiority while acknowledging Canadian effectiveness. On June 13th, Himmler issues a directive to SS intelligence services ordering them to investigate the ethnic composition of Canadian units fighting in Normandy. He specifically requests information about how many British personnel are embedded in Canadian formations. The intelligence services, knowing what answer Himmler wants, produce reports suggesting that Canadian units include significant British liaison personnel, who are actually providing tactical leadership. These reports are largely fabricated, telling Himmler what he wants to hear rather than what is true. But Himmler accepts them without question because they confirm his pre-existing beliefs. On June 15th, Himmler visits France for the first time since the invasion. He tours rear areas and meets with SS commanders, including Kurt Meyer of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Meyer, who has been fighting the Canadians for 9 days, gives Himmler a realistic assessment of the situation. The Canadians are excellent soldiers. They are aggressive in attack and stubborn in defense. They fight with skill and courage. Meyer, a combat veteran of multiple fronts, respects his enemy. Himmler's response to this assessment is telling. According to Meyer's post-war testimony, Himmler listened to the briefing with increasing discomfort. When Meyer finished, Himmler said, "You are describing British soldiers, not Canadians. Are you certain these are not British units using Canadian identification?" Meyer, taken aback, assured Himmler that the identification was certain. Prisoners had been taken, unit insignia were documented. These were definitely Canadians. Himmler then asked, "What is the racial composition? How many are of British stock versus French or other lesser bloodlines?" Meyer, who cared about combat effectiveness rather than racial purity, did not have this information. He said the prisoners they had taken seemed to be primarily English-speaking, suggesting British origin, but that some French-Canadian units were also present. Himmler seized on this. There is your answer. The effective units are those with British racial stock. The French-Canadian units will prove inferior when tested. This exchange, documented in Meyer's post-war testimony and corroborated by other witnesses, shows Himmler's desperate need to preserve his racial worldview, even when confronted with direct evidence contradicting it. Meyer's telling him that Canadians generally are effective soldiers. Himmler insists on subdividing Canadians into racial categories so that he can attribute effectiveness to acceptable racial groups and inferiority to unacceptable ones. But even this mental gymnastics becomes difficult to maintain as the Battle of Normandy progresses, because French-Canadian units, when they enter combat, prove to be just as effective as English-Canadian units. The Régiment de la Chaudière, a French-Canadian unit, fights with distinction throughout the campaign, and the Canadians generally, regardless of linguistic or ethnic background, continue to hold their ground against the SS and inflict heavy casualties. By late June, Himmler is forced to acknowledge, at least privately, that the Canadians are not collapsing as he predicted, but he cannot admit that his racial theories are wrong. So he constructs an even more elaborate explanation. On June 24th, Himmler issues a classified memorandum to senior SS officers that attempts to explain Canadian effectiveness while preserving Nazi racial ideology. The memorandum, captured after the war and entered into evidence at the Nuremberg trials, is a masterpiece of ideological contortion. In it, Himmler argues that Canadian military effectiveness is due to the preservation of Nordic racial elements in the Canadian population, combined with the harshness of the Canadian climate, which has eliminated weaker racial stocks through natural selection. He further argues that the Canadian soldier, while racially inferior to the German, is racially superior to the American, whose population has been mongrelized by immigration from inferior races. This memorandum reveals the core of Himmler's thinking. He cannot deny that Canadians are fighting effectively, but he must fit that effectiveness into his racial framework, so he adjusts the framework slightly, promoting Canadians from inferior colonials to moderately acceptable Nordic derivatives. It is an admission of error disguised as ideological refinement, but it is not a genuine acknowledgement of the truth. The truth is that military effectiveness has nothing to do with racial purity and everything to do with training, equipment, leadership, morale, and tactics. But Himmler cannot accept this truth, because accepting it would invalidate his entire worldview and, by extension, justify the Holocaust and the entire Nazi racial project. If race does not determine military capability, then perhaps race does not determine anything else either. And if that is true, then Himmler is not a visionary scientist, but a mass murderer. That thought is intolerable. So Himmler continues to twist and adjust his theories to accommodate uncomfortable facts while never questioning the fundamental premises. The Battle of Normandy continues through July and into August. The Canadians are heavily involved in the fighting around Caen, particularly in Operations Atlantic Spring and Totalize. They face not just the 12th SS but also other elite German units, including the 1st SS Panzer Corps. The fighting is extraordinarily costly for both sides. The Canadians take heavy casualties but continue to advance. The Germans take even heavier casualties and slowly retreat. Throughout this period, Himmler receives regular reports on the Canadian performance. These reports consistently note Canadian effectiveness, Canadian tenacity, and Canadian aggressiveness, and with each report, Himmler's explanations become more strained and more desperate. On July 8th, after the Canadians capture Carpiquet airfield in a costly assault, Himmler tells his staff, "The Canadian success at Carpiquet was due to overwhelming material superiority, not to any inherent fighting quality. Any army, given unlimited artillery support and air supremacy, could achieve similar results." This explanation minimizes the fact that the Germans also had artillery and that effective use of supporting fires requires coordination and skill. But it allows Himmler to avoid acknowledging Canadian competence. On July 20th, the day of the failed assassination attempt against Hitler, Himmler is preoccupied with the conspiracy and its suppression. But even in the midst of this crisis, when asked about the situation in Normandy, he makes time to comment on the Canadians. According to testimony from SS officers present, Himmler said, "The Canadians are being used by the Anglo-Americans as expendable troops. They are given the most difficult objectives because British and American lives are considered more valuable. The Canadians accept this role because they lack the racial consciousness to recognize they are being exploited." This interpretation of Canadian operations is both cynical and wrong. Canadian forces were given difficult missions because they were considered reliable and effective, not because they were considered expendable. But Himmler's interpretation preserves his view of Canadians as inferior and exploited rather than competent and valued. On August 1st, as the Allies prepare for Operation Totalize, a major Canadian-led offensive toward Falaise, Himmler issues orders to SS units facing the Canadians. The orders emphasize that the SS represents the racial elite of Germany and must demonstrate this superiority on the battlefield. Any failure against colonial troops is not merely a military defeat, but a racial disgrace. These orders place enormous psychological pressure on SS units. They are not just fighting a military campaign, they are fighting to validate Nazi racial ideology. And when human beings are asked to fight not just for tactical objectives, but for abstract ideological principles, the results are often catastrophic. The SS units facing the Canadians fight with fanatical determination, but also with increasing desperation. They take casualties they cannot afford. They launch counterattacks that have no strategic purpose except to demonstrate fighting spirit. And gradually, they are ground down. Operation Totalize, launched on August 8th, sees Canadian and Polish forces attack toward Falaise, with the goal of closing the Falaise pocket and trapping the German 7th Army. The operation involves innovative night attacks with armor, heavy bombing, and massed artillery. It is a sophisticated, well-planned offensive. The SS units defending, including remnants of the 12th SS Panzer Division and the 1st SS Panzer Division, fight desperately to hold their positions. The battle is intense and confused. The Canadians make significant gains but do not achieve breakthrough as quickly as hoped. The operation eventually succeeds in contributing to the encirclement of German forces in the Falaise pocket, but at great cost to both sides. Himmler, receiving reports on Totalize, seizes on the fact that the Canadians did not achieve immediate breakthrough. On August 10th, he tells a staff meeting, the Canadian offensive toward Falaise has stalled. This demonstrates what I have been saying. The Canadians can achieve initial success through weight of material, but lack the fighting spirit and racial quality to sustain offensive operations against determined SS resistance. This interpretation ignores the fact that the Canadians continued to fight for 2 weeks and eventually achieved their strategic objective of closing the Falaise pocket. But it allows Himmler to claim vindication for his racial theories. By August 20th, the Falaise pocket is closed. Tens of thousands of German soldiers are killed or captured. The German 7th Army is effectively destroyed. The road to Paris and beyond is open to the Allies. The Normandy campaign is over, and Germany has lost. Himmler's response to this strategic catastrophe is to blame the Wehrmacht, to blame the Luftwaffe, to blame anyone except the SS, and certainly not to question his own ideological certainties. In a meeting with Hitler on August 23rd, recorded in multiple sources, Himmler discusses the Normandy defeat. He tells Hitler, "The SS divisions fought magnificently. They held far longer than Wehrmacht units. The loss of Normandy was due to inadequate support from other branches of the military and to the overwhelming material superiority of the enemy, not to any failure of will or racial quality on the part of our SS troops." Hitler, who shares Himmler's racial worldview, accepts this explanation. Neither man seriously considers that the Allies, including the Canadians, simply outfought German forces through better tactics, better coordination, better use of combined arms, and better operational planning. Both men need to believe that German defeat was due to factors other than Allied superiority, because admitting Allied superiority would undermine the entire ideological structure on which the Nazi regime is built. In the months that follow, as the Allies advance across France and toward Germany, Himmler occasionally comments on Canadian forces. These comments show a gradual, grudging acknowledgement of Canadian effectiveness, but never an admission that his racial theories were wrong. On September 15th, after Canadian forces liberate ports on the English Channel, Himmler tells an audience of SS recruits, "The Canadians have proven to be more formidable opponents than we initially estimated. This is because the best Nordic blood of Britain migrated to Canada, taking with it genetic strengths that have been diluted in Britain itself by mongrelization. The Canadians we face are, in effect, fighting on behalf of Anglo-Saxon racial interests, even as they lack the cultural sophistication of true Germanic peoples." This explanation is absurd on multiple levels, but it shows how Himmler's mind works. He can now acknowledge that Canadians are effective soldiers, but he does so by reframing them as Nordic rather than colonial, by attributing their effectiveness to racial factors that align with his ideology. He has learned nothing from the Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach, except that his explanations need to be more sophisticated to accommodate inconvenient facts. On October 7th, as Canadian forces fight in the Battle of the Scheldt, Himmler receives reports on the difficult conditions of that campaign. Canadian forces are fighting in flooded terrain, in terrible weather, against determined German resistance. They are taking heavy casualties, but continuing to advance. Himmler's comment, recorded by an aide, is revealing. The Canadians are being wasted by their Anglo-American masters in impossible campaigns. This proves that despite their racial potential, they lack the political consciousness to resist exploitation. A true Germanic people would refuse such missions. Even now, even after months of evidence of Canadian capability and determination, Himmler cannot fully accept Canadian agency. In his mind, Canadians are still tools being used by others, never independent actors making their own decisions. By early 1945, as Germany faces total defeat, Himmler's worldview collapses along with the Third Reich. But his response to the Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach remains a revealing case study in ideological blindness. After the war, during the Nuremberg trials and subsequent proceedings, many documents relating to Himmler's statements and directives were entered into evidence. Himmler himself did not stand trial. He committed suicide shortly after being captured by British forces in May 1945, but his subordinates testified extensively about his thinking and his responses to various military situations. Several SS officers who served with Himmler were asked specifically about his reaction to Canadian forces in Normandy and his statements about the breakthrough at Juno Beach. Their testimony is consistent. Himmler initially dismissed the Canadian breakthrough as insignificant. When forced to acknowledge Canadian effectiveness, he attributed it to British leadership or overwhelming material superiority. When those explanations became untenable, he reframed Canadians as racially acceptable rather than racially inferior. But he never admitted that his fundamental premise that race determines military capability was wrong. One particularly revealing piece of testimony comes from SS Brigadeführer Walter Schellenberg, chief of SS Foreign Intelligence, who worked closely with Himmler throughout the war. Schellenberg testified that Himmler was obsessed with fitting all intelligence into his racial framework. When Canadian effectiveness was reported, he demanded that we investigate the genetic background of Canadian soldiers. When we could not provide evidence that Canadian effectiveness was due to British admixture, he became angry and accused us of incompetent intelligence work. He could not accept that a nation he had categorized as inferior was performing at a high level. Militarily, Schellenberg's testimony continues. I once asked the Reichsführer directly, after the Normandy campaign, whether the Canadian performance had caused him to reconsider his racial theories. He became very cold and told me that theories developed over decades of research could not be invalidated by a single military campaign. He said that the Canadians had been lucky, that they had faced depleted German forces, and that in any case, they were racially closer to Germans than he had previously thought. He never admitted being wrong, he simply adjusted his categories. This testimony captures the essence of Himmler's response to the Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach. It was not a learning experience. It was not a moment of self-reflection. It was simply another data point to be massaged and reinterpreted until it fit his pre-existing worldview. Other testimony from the trials reveals that Himmler's insistence on racial explanations for military outcomes had practical consequences that harmed German war efforts. SS divisions were sometimes kept in combat longer than militarily prudent because withdrawing would be seen as a racial failure. SS units were given impossible missions and ordered to hold at all costs because doing otherwise would suggest racial inferiority. And SS intelligence services, rather than providing accurate assessments of enemy capabilities, learned to tell Himmler what he wanted to hear about racial factors in enemy performance. All of this made the SS less effective as a military force. The ideological burden of proving racial superiority actually undermined military effectiveness. And nowhere was this more evident than in Normandy, where SS units fought with fanatical determination, but also with strategic stupidity, taking losses they could not afford in battles they could not win, all to prove ideological points that had no basis in reality. The Canadian soldiers who broke through at Juno Beach in 47 minutes had no idea that their achievement was causing this kind of cognitive dissonance at the highest levels of SS command. They were too busy fighting and dying to worry about what Himmler thought, but in a sense, their success was a hammer blow against the entire structure of Nazi racial ideology. Because the Canadians were not supposed to be able to do what they did. They came from a small nation. They were a mixture of British and French ancestry. They were colonials in the Nazi classification system. And yet they broke through the Atlantic Wall faster than anyone expected. They held against elite SS divisions. They advanced through Normandy despite horrific casualties. They fought with skill, courage, and determination that matched or exceeded anything the Germans could field. And every day they did this, they proved that Nazi racial theory was wrong. Race did not determine military capability. Training did, leadership did, equipment did, morale did, but not race. Himmler could never accept this truth. He went to his grave believing in racial hierarchy, even as that hierarchy crumbled around him in military defeat. What Himmler said when Canada broke through Juno Beach in 47 minutes can be summarized in several key themes that emerged over the days and weeks following D-Day. First, he said it was insignificant because the defenders were weak. When that explanation failed, he said it was due to British leadership or American equipment. When that failed, he said the effective Canadians were actually of acceptable Nordic racial stock. When even that became difficult to maintain, he simply stopped talking about it much and focused on other enemies. But through all of this, he never said the one thing that was true. That the Canadians were effective soldiers who had been well-trained and well-led, and that their effectiveness had nothing to do with racial purity and everything to do with professional military competence. Himmler could not say this because saying it would have invalidated his entire life's work. The Holocaust, the SS, the entire Nazi racial project. All of it rested on the premise that race mattered above all else. If race did not determine military capability, perhaps it did not determine anything else either. And if that were true, then Himmler was not a scientist or a philosopher, but simply a criminal responsible for the deaths of millions. That realization would have destroyed him psychologically. So he never allowed himself to reach it. He twisted reality instead, adjusting his interpretations to preserve his theories, no matter how much evidence accumulated against them. In the end, Himmler's response to the Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach is a lesson in the dangers of ideological certainty. When you believe something so strongly that no amount of contradictory evidence can change your mind, you have stopped thinking and started simply rationalizing. And in war, as in life, the side that sees reality most clearly usually wins. The Canadians saw reality clearly. They were well-trained soldiers with good equipment and effective tactics. They used these advantages to break through German defenses. There was no mystery to it, no racial magic, just professional military competence applied to a difficult problem. Himmler never saw this clearly. He saw everything through the distorting lens of racial ideology. And that blindness, multiplied across the entire Nazi leadership, is one reason why Germany lost the war. The Canadians broke through Juno Beach in 47 minutes, and Heinrich Himmler, confronted with this fact, said everything except the truth. That is his legacy, and that is the final judgment of history on ideological fanaticism divorced from reality.